Welcome back to Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. My name is Josh Hasten, correspondent for JNS News. I'm in studio with Alex Trayman, the CEO of JNS. Hope all is well with you, Alex. Top story here. Over the last 24 hours, there were two elections, one in the UK, one in France. Let's start with the UK. A Labour Party victory in the election in the UK. The British Labour Party won a landslide victory, making Keir Starmer the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Starmer inherited a dysfunctional Labour Party severely damaged by accusations of anti-Semitism. If you remember, previous leader was Jeremy Corbyn, who's not going anywhere, by the way. Jeremy Corbyn held on to his seat in North London as an independent, but here you have a victory for the UK. Let's talk about how it could potentially impact the state of Israel.
Well, I think democracies in general, we'll talk about France in a moment, are, not putting their best foot forward. We see the debates in the presidential election in the United States. We see here now what's going on in the UK with the left wing returning to power. It wasn't too long ago that Jeremy Corbyn was the head of the Labour Party. Eventually, he was tossed out over blatant anti-Semitism. But as you said, he retained his seat. He ran as an independent, and the quote-unquote Corbynites actually fared pretty well in the election. And the situation for Jews in the UK has been terrible over the last couple of years, with many Jews in London now saying that they don't really feel safe to be there anymore the way they had in the past. So we'll have to see how this election impacts the fate of Jews in Great Britain.
In terms of policy, Starmer had a whole statement on Israel calling for a two-state solution, and perhaps even more disturbing was Britain's new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, who said that Britain wants a balanced position on the war in the Middle East. A balanced position to me means is you're equating Israel with Hamas. That's balanced. That's what it sounds like he's talking about.
Well, it doesn't sound like it's too much different than the positions that the most recent Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, himself a former prime minister, was espousing, consistently talking about a two-state solution and really not showing his favor for Israel during the war so far. So in terms of Great Britain's foreign policy toward Israel, I don't know if you're going to see a dramatic change from the government of Rishi Sunak, who was a conservative, and again with Cameron as the foreign secretary. So we might see more of the same there. And I think the real potent question is, what will be the change for London and Great Britain's Jews in general?
And moving on to France, as a result of yesterday's election, at this point, a government has not been formed, but there was a victory for the extreme left and the center. Initially, in the first round, the right wing, it looked like that they were going to come out ahead. But in this case, it looks like that the left and the center, they're the ones who are going to be charged with forming a government. And there's a few important points here. Number one, a top rabbi in France last week said, and this is an amazing, terrible, but amazing quote, saying that there is no future for Jews in France. That was last week. And then after yesterday's results, you had prominent French Jews lamenting the electoral success of the political bloc that features a far-left party widely regarded as anti-Semitic in the parliamentary elections. So you have socialists, communists, all these other anti-Semites, and the French Jews are concerned. All their leadership is concerned about their future in France.
Yeah, Macron himself, while being positioned as a centrist, that's like a center-left position. And, we're seeing this rebound across Europe where people are upset with the policies of the left wing across many European nations, which allowed for the importing of millions and millions of Muslims from Syria and elsewhere that have just flooded all over Europe and have really changed the social fabric of the entire continent. And now Macron's party is losing ground both to the extremists on the left and also to the right. So the center is declining. And as you mentioned, this left-wing party, it's not a ruling party. It's a collection of some far-left parties that banded together with the opportunity to try to fight against the right wing. And as you mentioned, there's some really bad elements there. But it does look like there's an overall balance between the left wing, the right wing, and the center. So I guess the hope is that somehow or another, neither side will be able to take the agenda too far in any one given direction, and hopefully France will just stay the course. But you have the same situation that we talked about in the UK, where the safety of French Jews has been called into question. There's been a massive aliyah of French Jews to Israel in the last, I'd say, 10 to 15 years here. That has slowed down, and the question is if it will pick up now after the results of this election.
Yeah, time will tell if the French Jewry will heed the words of their leadership, which is extremely worried about the future. Let's turn to the the domestic situation, if you will, here in Israel. Of course, the war in Gaza and the war in the north with Hezbollah we'll talk about later. But there has been a restart in hostage negotiations. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu several days ago informed U.S. President Biden, I believe this was a July 4th call, of his decision to dispatch a delegation to continue negotiations to free 120 hostages. And he also laid out Israel's red lines. Number one, resume fighting until all of the war goals have been met, an end to arms smuggling through into Gaza via Egypt, no return of terrorists to the north, maximizing the number of living hostages released. And Hamas's response to these terms, apparently they have dropped, and you have to take it with a grain of salt. They've dropped the demand that Israel commit up front to ending the war. So again, you can't count on Hamas or any of their statements or whatnot. But the bottom line here is you have the President of the United States, you have the Prime Minister Netanyahu. They're having conversations, and Israel is going to dispatch its negotiating team to Qatar and I believe to Egypt as well in order to try to get some sort of deal done.
And this is the top negotiating team. This is the head of the Mossad, David Barnea, and other top security and intelligence officials that are taking part of these negotiations. This isn't the first round of attempted negotiations since 110 hostages were released several months back. There's been several attempts to get negotiations started. Each one of those attempts has really failed, and ultimately Hamas has rejected all of the offers put on the table, including the offer that President Biden laid out. He called it the Israeli offer, and Blinken said it was a very generous offer, and then made it clear that Hamas was not, quote, operating in good faith, that the terror organization that took the 250 hostages was not operating in good faith, apparently. They discovered that. So there's another attempt now, but I think the thing that's changed here and does make a potential hostage release more likely is the stage of the war. We're getting now towards the period where even the IDF and Netanyahu and Gallant have announced that Israel is shifting from phase 2 of the war, which is a very intensive phase, to what they call phase 3, which would be more about targeted raids with smaller amounts of troops. Essentially, the IDF has moved from the north of Gaza all the way down to the south. They're wrapping up the operation in Rafah. Israel would like to see a way out of the conflict, even if the conflict will go on in a more moderate pace, as time goes on, because ultimately you do have Hamas operating as guerrillas and in disorganized bands throughout the Strip, and you're going to have to continue to go in there. But they do want this more organized phase of the war to come to an end. And as I had spoken about with War Cabinet member, Minister of Strategic Affairs Ron Dermer, Israel does see a path to end the heavy round of conflict with a deal that gets back hostages, potentially lets senior leadership of Hamas out, in order for all sides to say that the war is over and that everybody's gotten something out of a conclusion. So we have to see what happens. I don't think anybody can really know if this is going to be successful or not.
Well, Israel yesterday and today back in Gaza City, attacking Hamas targets there. And in terms of the hostage negotiations, the Prime Minister's office says that there's still gaps in the sides. That being said, yesterday there was protests throughout the country. You have those who are calling for Netanyahu to reach an immediate deal with Hamas, blocking major highways throughout the country. I don't know if you got stuck in traffic. I managed to avoid it, but you're talking about the major transportation centers throughout the country blocked by these protesters and all sorts of different protests taking place.
Yeah, a few important points here regarding these protests. This is an extension of all the anti-Netanyahu protests that we've seen in Israel for years. Before it was protesting Netanyahu during the election cycles. Then it was protesting against Netanyahu's proposed judicial reforms. And now the point of the protest is to hold Netanyahu responsible for not bringing the hostages back. You had Einav Zengauker, who is the mother of one of the hostages, who in a stunt put herself into a cage that was then being hoisted up by a crane over Begin Road where the protests were blocking the streets. And she said that she pulled this stunt because, quote, "we are all held captive by Netanyahu and Sinwar." Okay, so she's comparing Yahya Sinwar, who's the mastermind of the worst terror massacre in the history of the state of Israel, in which 3,000 people came across the border, the firing of 40,000 rockets, the taking of 250-plus hostages, and bringing them into tunnels, which they dug for a period of many years, and comparing Sinwar to Netanyahu. And so we see here that these protests are really just focused ultimately on trying to push Netanyahu out to get to an election, just like we saw last week in France, just like we saw in the UK. We're seeing that these parliamentary democracies are able to be collapsed at any time by protests, and certainly the hostage protest, and you have to give credit. You have to give some credit here to the families who just desperately want their children home. But we have already seen the merging of the hostage protest together with the anti-Netanyahu protest. It's become one unit, and perhaps you can argue that it became one unit even from the day after October 7th.
Turning our attention to the north, yesterday Hezbollah fired at least 200 rockets and 20 drones at northern Israel. There were attacks in places such as Akko, Nahariya, even some attacks which reached as far south as the Kinneret, the Lake of Galilee. Several Israelis were injured in that attack. And then you had in the western Galilee, you had other Israelis injured. You had one American injured, from what I understand, who actually was trying to help the soldiers. He was a civilian who came up and was teaching soldiers how to use some of the drone technology, which they had purchased from a company in the United States. So injuries taking place in the north with rockets launched, and another huge barrage, and as well as the fires, which unfortunately, I mean, it's really, really hot here in Israel these days. These rockets land, they start fires, and a lot of the forestry in northern Israel has been damaged, along with the buildings in the major cities up there.
Yeah, I mean, this barrage last week was one of the largest since the war started. I mean, on the holiday of Shavuot, we had 150 rockets fired. We had another day where there was close to 200 rockets fired, but you have 200 rockets being fired in a single day, and they're doing immense damage. You're not hearing so much about them in the international press because Israel evacuated over 80,000 residents from this security perimeter around the border with Lebanon. So you're not hearing about too many deaths, but the amount of property damage that these rockets have done have been immense. It demonstrates that Israel doesn't really have a solution for these rockets that are coming out of southern Lebanon right now, the same way that they do have a solution for the Qassam rockets being fired from Gaza. And it leaves a lot of concern about whether Israel ultimately does have missile defense if Hezbollah would start to use their more serious weaponry, including the 150 to 200,000 rockets, many of them which are long-range and precision-guided. And you have to wonder, what is the red line here? What's the escalation to which Israel says, we can't accept this anymore? You do get the sense that Israelis are trying to avoid this conflict. I would mention here that I think that some of the talking points that have been coming out of Israel, not necessarily only by the government, some by the government, but by many other experts here, are very weak messages. Number one, they're saying, Israel doesn't want to fight right now against Hezbollah because the soldiers have been fighting for 8 months already, and they're tired, and they want to go back home. They want to go home. They want to go to their jobs. So the soldiers don't want to fight right now. Well, I don't think that's a good message to be sending to Hezbollah and to be sending to Iran. Then you had the prime minister coming out a few weeks back and saying that the United States has been slow-tracking weapons to Israel, basically insinuating that Israel doesn't have the weapons that it needs to fight a sustained war against Hezbollah. Now, whether or not those announcements were effective in fast-tracking some of the weapons, and you can judge it on that basis now, but if you just judge it on how your enemies look at this, so they're hearing that the soldiers are tired and they don't want to fight, and you don't have enough weapons, and they see that when they fire at the northern towns like Metula and Kiryat Shmona, that they're inflicting tremendous damage. Also, people are saying that the IDF prefers to wait until the laser system is back up. So you hear Israelis saying what Israel wants to do is to wait a little bit, let the soldiers go back home and recover, while Israel rearms itself with weapons from the U.S. or elsewhere and gets its missile defense system up and running, and then it will fight the war against Hezbollah. If I'm sitting in Lebanon right now next to Hanan Nasrallah, I'm saying, do I want to wait until the soldiers are rested, until Israel has its weapons back and their missile defense is up and running the way they want? Or do I want to fight this now when it's even clear that the United States is not behind them? So, I think this messaging might lead us closer to an all-out conflict with Hezbollah than what I think is intended by these messages.
Hey, you mentioned red lines yesterday, and somebody showed that, I think it was Defense Minister Gallant, had red lines on a map indicating, like, if the rockets reach a certain point south from Hezbollah in Lebanon, that would be it. And then I saw somebody else draw just a bunch of squiggly red lines all over the top of the country, indicating that we're already past that point, that they've gotten that far already. So Israel's going to have to make some decisions up ahead. But one thing Israel is deciding on, switching gears here, is the approvals of building in Judea and Samaria. The IDF's Higher Planning Council for Judea and Samaria held a 2-day meeting to advance plans for 5,300 new homes for residents of Judea and Samaria. This was part of a security cabinet decision, which also included the transformation of 5 what are called outposts, neighborhoods in communities, essentially legalizing those. One, as they call them, settlements, I don't use that word, one community for each of the 5 European countries that unilaterally recognized Palestinian statehood in the last few months. So from where I'm sitting, I am all for building in Judea and Samaria. I think it's a good idea. I think they need to approve more and more homes and building in Judea and Samaria. But I will take an issue with the fact that it seems that when you pull a stunt like this, it looks as if Israel is punishing the terrorists for carrying out their attacks. Now, on one hand, obviously, I'm for the building. On the other hand, I think that Israel should be building all the time. It should be irregardless of if a terror attack happens here, a terror attack happens there. In my opinion, I think it's the wrong messaging. The message should be, this is our historic, ancestral, biblical homeland, and we have the right. We regained Judea and Samaria in 1967. That we have the right to build throughout Judea and Samaria, and it shouldn't be as a result of this terror attack, or it should not even have any sort of appearance that this is done in order to so-called punish the other side. This should be done as a matter of policy, and I think that in terms of the PR, I think we're off here. But again, I applaud the building of 5,300 new units.
Yeah, I think it's also important to talk about what some of these outposts are. One of these outposts is Givat Asaf. Okay, Givat Asaf is on the main road, Route 60, the biblical highway that goes all the way from the city of Beersheba on the south, all the way to the city of Shlem or Nablus in the north. It passes right through Jerusalem, and it goes by all biblical cities like Hebron, Bethlehem, Bet El, Shiloh, and others. And it's right by the turnoff to Beit El and to Ramallah. The reason why it was established was because there were some shootings on that road, and people were killed. And so the idea has always been that if you want to provide security for an area, you need to bring the military. And if you want to bring the military, so you need to bring civilians to the area, and that forces the military to be in the area. Now, when I moved to Israel in 2004, I was living in Bethel, and I get a call from my friend 3 days after I was in the country, and they said, we have to go down to Givat Asaf right now. I said, why? They said, because the government's going to raise the community. At the time, it was about 17 caravans on the corner there. And sure enough, we went down there. A few thousand other people went down there, and there was a stay of execution. The army came, and ultimately they decided in negotiations with the leadership of the region that they were not going to destroy the community that night. So these outposts are not new outposts. That was back in 2004, and that community had already been standing for about 10 years. Okay, so you're talking about communities that just haven't been legalized, but they've been there for a long time. So saying that you're legalizing them, that provides basic services for the residents of the communities, which have been connecting to the electric grid seemingly illegally, but they've been doing it that way for 30 years. And the same thing with other infrastructures. So, legalizing these outposts is the right thing to do if you have people living there for 30 years and you don't intend to kick them out. So legalize the places. The Israeli government has legalized so many illegal Arab constructions all throughout Jerusalem, thousands and thousands of units. So this is very consistent with their policies in other places.
Yeah, legalize or have been turning a blind eye. I mean, you have thousands of European Union-sponsored buildings being put up all throughout Area C, which is under full Israeli control. And, it's been a major, major problem. You have organizations like Regavim that have been fighting against that for many, many years. And the buildings are still going up, perhaps at a slower pace than has been they have been in the past. But nevertheless, it seems like there's a certain standard where you have these Israeli communities, which were always on the threat of being dismantled, but you have a legal Arab building which is running rampant in strategic areas, and their goal is to establish a state, basically saying, well, in lieu of negotiations with Israel, we are just going to create facts on the ground in strategic areas throughout. And then at the end of the day, we'll say, look, we're already here anyway. Might as well just turn that over to a PA state. So that's been their strategy under the Fayyad plan since 2009. So, Alex, there's been a news item here that has been running throughout media and social media over the last several days, and it's a really unusual story. You had 3 Israelis on October the 7th who picked up and went down and helped defend those who were under attack in the south. And somewhere on that day, on October the 7th, the 3 of them came across a Hamas terrorist, and they killed that Hamas terrorist. And for some reason or another, they were arrested for killing that Hamas terrorist. So whatever the police decided, perhaps he no longer posed a threat or whatnot. I mean, the fact of the matter is, a Hamas terrorist entered into Israel. These 3 made the decision that they were going to kill him, and they were punished. You even have Benny Gantz, who's now head of the opposition for the National Unity Party, the other day saying anyone who dared, quote, anyone who dared to cross the border from Gaza that day was sentenced to death. All of them pose a clear and immediate danger. Yet somehow these 3 were arrested for killing a Nukhba terrorist who came into Israel. 2 of their names have been released, Shachar Ophir and Israel Biton, who are now under house arrest. And the 3rd individual involved in this case is still in the hands of the police. What's going on here?
This is one of those moments that make you scratch your head if you're an Israeli, and you wonder if the system is really in place to control the behavior of Israelis, or if the system is in place to keep Israelis safe. I mean, again, you said it correctly. You had 3,000 terrorists came across the border. They murdered 1,200 people. They injured thousands of other people, and they kidnapped over 250 people. And you had many people answering the calls and going down to the south. By the way, when many people felt that the IDF did not adequately respond and that they didn't put the Apache helicopters in the sky, and that the IDF didn't secure the area fast enough, even and after missing out on all of the warning signs that this was going to happen, they didn't even respond. And here you have 3 Israelis among many others that did respond. One of them was a United Hatzalah first responder, like an ambucycle first responder, and there were tons of stories of ambulance first responders that answered calls from people because the army wasn't picking up the phone, saying that there was injuries and deaths, and they ran down, and they were the army on October 7th. They killed a lot of the terrorists, many of them with their own personal handguns. Here you have a case where 3 individuals, they're being accused of taking a gun off of a dead terrorist and using it to kill another terrorist. Okay, these 3 people, they should be getting awards, medals of honor for jumping, risking their own lives to save others on October 7th. And here the police and the state prosecution is focused on targeting those 3. How come the state prosecution is not busy trying to figure out what the heck went wrong leading up to October 7th and what went wrong on October 7th that this should happen? And now they're going to turn around and and they're going to arrest 3 brave Israelis that risked their own lives to save others and did what any Israeli should have done on that day. But I'll tell you, I do think that it gives Israelis a view into what the state prosecution is, into what the legal system is, into what the judicial system here is, and now you can understand why you had a right-wing government that wanted to change the way the court operates because of incidents like this.
Yeah, it's a tremendously disappointing story, and as you said, it really shows you who wields the power at the end of the day in this country, and that's why you have so many calls for reform and change at the top. Sticking with October the 7th here, another story which is disturbing that came out this week. This is out of the United States. U.S. terror czar Brett Holmgren, he told the Washington Post in an interview that October the 7th was a, quote, generational event that terrorists in the Middle East and other parts of the world will use as a recruiting opportunity. And when you and I discussed this off the microphone, you got very, very upset by the story and very upset by his comments. And I want you to clarify what's on your mind here.
Well, this guy, Brett Holmgren, who is preparing to become the acting director of the National Counterterrorism Center, okay, on July 18th, he's going to become that. And previously, he held a very high rank. He's the Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research. Okay, so this is a very high-ranking counterterror official inside the Biden administration, and he says that October 7th is providing inspiration for lone actors. I mean, this is a classic blaming the victim strategy, where you can't control the terrorists. So again, now you blame Israel for the fact that now you have other lone wolf terrorists, so to speak, which there's no such thing as a lone wolf terrorist because they all are incited to violence from an early age and they're part of these networks on social media and elsewhere. But October 7th was not a lone actor attack, okay? October 7th was one of the most highly coordinated terror assaults in modern history, with over 3,000 members of a terror army crossing a border into enemy territory, killing thousands of others, shooting tens of thousands of rockets, and like I said before, bringing them into tunnels which had been dug over a period of many years. So one of the most highly coordinated paramilitary terror assaults in history, and now Israel's being blamed for other lone terror actors who themselves are connecting to the job that Hamas tried to do on October 7th. So, this is very dangerous because of where it's coming from, right? Like, I would expect to hear Hassan Nasrallah say that the October 7th attack is an inspiration for other terrorists around the world. I wouldn't be expecting that to come from the counterterrorism czar in the United States, throwing their number one ally under the bus when they get hit with one of the worst terror attacks in history.
Yeah, and it's disappointing when you go on social media when Israel, who, as you said, was attacked on that horrific day in October, ends up being the aggressor when it's clearly not the case, and so many people fall for the lies and the misconceptions as to what actually happened and fall for all this kind of stuff.
And furthermore, this guy is blaming future terror attacks on U.S. support for Israel in the wake of what happened on October 7th. So he's basically saying if we want to have less terrorism in the world, what we need to do in terms of U.S. policy, of which he is an important member in determining what that policy is saying we need to have less support for the state of Israel, because he's saying terrorists around the world are watching what we're doing. And if we support Israel, that makes us more likely to have terror attacks against Western targets as well. So it's very scary. It's a very scary situation that's what your ally is saying about one of the worst terror attacks in history. He should be saying exactly the opposite. He should be saying right now that if you want to prevent future terror attacks, then organizations like Hamas have to be taken completely out of commission. They have to understand that the price of committing an attack is so severe that nobody else will want to commit an attack. And instead, it's exactly the opposite of what he's saying.
Yeah, it's all those haters out there who talk about defunding Israel, ignoring how much Israel actually contributes to the safety and the well-being of the United States and other countries around the world. And that's certainly disappointing. And a lot of those college protesters over the spring semester We're also talking about how the United States government should defund Israel as a result of the situation in Gaza. Somehow we're the ones being attacked, yet they want to defund Israel. But it's summer vacation now, so I don't know how many protests are taking place on the campuses, but you do have Congress, specifically Representative Elise Stefanik, a Republican from New York, and 9 other House members introducing an act that would potentially remove tax benefits and federal funding to public universities that do not combat anti-Semitism on their campuses. So again, students aren't there, but yet you have members of Congress recognizing that the fall semester is just around the corner, and you do have some of these universities on the highest levels who are turning a blind eye to Jew hatred on their campuses. Do you think any type of resolution like this is really going to make a dent or a difference in anti-Semitism taking place in colleges in the United States?
I mean, I think it can make a difference, on the above the surface anti-Semitism. We saw some of the worst situations for students on the campus where we saw in Carnegie Mellon University, kids were basically like locked in a library. Others felt unsafe to walk across the campus. And that's aside from the pro-terror encampments that were popping up on many campuses. And a lot of them have been removed. But as you mentioned, it's the summertime. I just spoke to somebody who was on the McGill campus, which is in Canada, not in the United States. But this past month, he said there's still an encampment over there. And there's a big worry about what's going to be on campus in September with the beginning of the next school year. And I think that the only thing that's going to make the universities and the presidents and the chancellors of the universities do the right thing with regard to providing a safe environment for Jewish students and making sure that there aren't these pro-terror encampments is to hit at the money supply of these universities. And we saw some of the major philanthropists do that. Bill Ackman and Mark Rowan and David Magerman and others pulling large donations from Ivy League universities. That sends a message. But here, this is more important because let's not forget that a lot of these universities are receiving federal and state funding from the government. And if you do want to take money from the federal government, then you have to adhere to federal laws and state laws. And there is the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which has been approved in many states, passed. Also, the federal government has accepted and adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, and everybody can see that this definition was crossed, during these encampments during this past year. So hopefully the universities will learn the lesson and will adhere to strict moral code and protect their Jewish students. Thanks in part to the work of Elise Stefanik, who, if you remember, she was the Congresswoman who was at the heart of these congressional hearings in which Claudine Gay of Harvard and the professors of MIT and Columbia and others came forward, and they at that time they said that anti-Semitism based on the context, right? So here, if you say it's just based on the context, okay, well, guess what? It's based on the context, but we can determine whether to send money to your university based on the context.
I agree with you. You got to hurt them in the wallets. And you've seen people like philanthropist Robert Kraft divert money from one of the universities to Yeshiva University. And there was a University of Pennsylvania alum who decided to, I'm talking about millions and millions of dollars, who donated to Bar-Ilan University instead. And here you have the federal government getting ready to hold these universities accountable and hit them where it counts in their wallets if they continue to turn a blind eye towards anti-Semitism.
And Stefanik said when she introduced the legislation that this is done to hold these institutions accountable with lofty financial punishments that will encourage them to investigate and crack down on instances of anti-Semitism and help foster a safer academic environment for all students, regardless of their gender, race, or religion.
Again, so summer school taking place right now, Congress not resting, and then we'll certainly see come the fall what happens on these campuses, especially if the war continues here in Israel. But it's not about Israel, though. It's about Jew hatred. That's really what this is all about. And that's all the time we have for today on another edition of Jerusalem Minute. Josh Haston here, correspondent for JNS, along with Alex Trayman, the CEO of JNS. Big shout out to Ryan Lifshitz for everything he does behind the scenes. Continue to watch all of the amazing programming and content on JNS TV, and go to jns.org for all the latest news coverage from the State of Israel. Continue to pray for the well-being of our soldiers, the brave men and women who are fighting 24/7 for our freedoms and the freedoms of all good people throughout the world. Have a great week, everybody.